On March 18, 2025, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, death row inmate Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr. was executed, bringing a final close to his sentence for the brutal kidnapping, rape, and murder of advertising executive Molly Elliott in 1996. The execution was carried out using a controversial new method, the state's first ever use of nitrogen gas asphyxiation, officially breaking a 15-year silence in Louisiana's death chamber. The journey from a bright student and a high school football star with a straight-A report card to a cold-blooded killer overnight is a chain of tragedy, violence, and haunting questions about justice. In his final hours, Hoffman declined a last meal, offered no final words, and took the secret of his true motive that fateful night to his grave. This is the story of a heinous crime and a legal battle that spanned nearly 3 decades. November evening in 1996, destiny set up a horrifying encounter in a downtown New Orleans parking garage. Molly Elliott, a promising 28-year-old advertising executive, had just finished a day of work and was on her way to her car. It was there she encountered Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr., an 18-year-old parking attendant. At gunpoint, Molly's life took a tragic turn from which she could never return. Hoffman forced her to drive to a nearby ATM, withdraw $200, and then took her to a secluded area in St. Tammany Parish. It was in that desolate place that the tragedy reached its climax. Hoffman brutally raped and then shot Molly execution style. Her body was found 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day. ATM receipts found with her clothing became a crucial clue. Security camera footage from the ATM, capturing the moment Molly stood next to an armed African-American man, helped police quickly identify and arrest Hoffman. These receipts seemed like a minor detail, but they would become the key to unlocking a confession that Hoffman would later try to recant. Remember this detail. It will become critically important when we analyze the trial. During his defense, lawyers would repeatedly cite Hoffman's mother as a source of his psychological trauma. Her death just a year before her son's execution added another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. This detail will help us better understand Hoffman's state of mind in his final days. What do you think turned a promising student with a bright future into a cold-blooded killer? Was it the result of a childhood of relentless abuse, or was a cruel nature hidden deep within him all along? Let's turn back the pages of the case file to find the answers, starting by looking at 2 parallel lives, 2 completely opposite destinies that intersected at one fateful point. Before becoming a name synonymous with crime, Molly Elliott was Mary Margaret Murphy Elliott, a young woman with a brilliant future ahead of her. Born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, Molly completed her college education in Southern California before moving to Los Angeles to start her career in advertising. It was there she met Andy Elliott, the man of her dreams. Their love blossomed, and in 1994, they decided to build a new life together in Covington, Louisiana, a peaceful town north of New Orleans. In the spring of 1995, they married, beginning a promising new chapter. Molly was a talented advertising executive, beloved by her colleagues, with a career on the rise. Her life was a bright picture of love, happiness, and ambition. While Molly and Andy were building their home in another corner of Louisiana, Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr. was also on his own path, but his was much rougher and darker. Hoffman was a student at Kennedy High School. Surprisingly, he was once a top student, a talented football quarterback for the school's team, and even had straight A's in all his subjects until the 11th grade. But then, everything began to spiral downward after he started a relationship with his girlfriend. Their lives intersected in November 1996. Molly, a successful professional, regularly parked at the Sheraton Hotel's garage, where Hoffman had just started working as a parking attendant less than 3 weeks prior. On one side was a woman at the peak of her life, on the other, a young man at a crossroads of fate. That parking garage became the tragic intersection where one life was extinguished and another was forever ruined. Molly had what seemed like a perfect life. but her husband, Andy, would later reveal something about the future they had planned together. A future of children, of the country home they had bought together, a future that was snatched away in the blink of an eye. Or stand Jessie Hoffman's unimaginable brutality, we must go back in time and look at a childhood stolen by violence and neglect. Born on September 1, 1978, Hoffman grew up in a family with 5 siblings. According to Marvin Fields, Hoffman's older brother, their family was not well off. At one point, they moved to Florida and lived in public housing. Hoffman's childhood and that of his siblings was a horrifying series of days under the abuse of their own mother. She would regularly whip them with thick belt pieces, and a horrifying punishment for stealing was forcing their small hands onto a hot stove until they blistered. The physical and emotional pain was deeply etched into Hoffman's young psyche. The family tragedy continued on May 31, 1998, when one of Hoffman's brothers, Charles Fields, was shot and killed at the age of 25 in New Orleans. According to criminal psychologists, severe and prolonged childhood trauma like Hoffman's can create a psychological, ticking time bomb. His defense lawyers later argued that the chronic abuse led to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and even brain damage. Being locked in a closet as a child caused claustrophobia, a phobia he had to use meditation techniques to cope with during his years in prison. Looking at Hoffman's escalation of crime, we don't see the pattern of a serial killer, but rather a sudden and catastrophic breakdown. From a good student and an athlete, his grades began to decline. From minor misbehaviors punished brutally, he made a giant leap to the ultimate crime: kidnapping, rape, and murder. This transformation suggests that there were perhaps warning signs that were ignored. A sudden drop in academic performance, a past of severe abuse, and possibly emotional isolation despite participating in team activities. These are signs that society needs to recognize and intervene before tragedy strikes. Let's reconstruct the horrifying night of November 26, 1996, through multiple lenses to get a complete picture of the tragedy. From Molly Elliott's perspective, it was the end of a normal workday. She walked into the parking garage, her mind perhaps still lingering on dinner plans with her husband. But then, the darkness of the garage concealed a deadly danger. A cold gun was pressed against her, and Molly's world fell apart. The extreme fear of being forced to drive to an ATM, the helplessness of having to withdraw money for a stranger, and then the terrifying ride to a deserted, unknown place. Every meter of the road was a meter of despair. On the banks of the Middle Pearl River, she was forced to her knees, and that was the last moment of her life. Jessie Hoffman, an 18-year-old parking attendant, made a decision that would forever change not only his own life, but also the lives of others. In his first statement to the police, he concocted a wild story. After kidnapping Molly and having sex with her, which he claimed was consensual, a mysterious armed man appeared, took Molly into the secluded area, and returned alone. Later, in another interrogation, he changed his story, saying the gun accidentally went off during a struggle with Molly. Neither version matched the physical evidence, showing a desperate attempt to evade responsibility. The picture of the crime gradually became clear. A couple stumbled upon Molly's discarded clothes and belongings in a vacant lot. Among them were 3 ATM receipts, the first clues to point the police in the right direction. And then, on Thanksgiving Day, a duck hunter made a gruesome discovery: the body of Molly Elliott. It was these ordinary people, by chance, who became crucial pieces in the investigation. Finally, from the perspective of the family, it was a nightmare without an end. Andy Elliott waited for his wife for dinner, but she never returned. Initial worry quickly turned into extreme fear. He reported her missing to the police and then had to face the most painful truth when he identified the body of the wife he loved so dearly. The pain of him and Molly's family is a wound that will never heal, a cruel reminder of the fragility of happiness. Undersight in the Molly Elliott's case progressed quickly thanks to the crucial clues the perpetrator accidentally left behind. Shortly after Molly's body was discovered on November 28, 1996, and her personal belongings were found by a couple, investigators immediately focused on the ATM receipts. The technology of the time, though not as advanced as today, played a decisive role. The security camera at the ATM had captured clear images of Molly and a man of color with a gun standing next to her. These photos were undeniable evidence, the key to solving the case. Based on the images and description, police quickly identified the suspect as Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr., a parking attendant at the same garage where Molly was abducted. The manhunt didn't last long. Hoffman was arrested. Initially, he denied the crime, but when confronted with the irrefutable evidence, especially the ATM footage, he had to admit his guilt. The initial confession, though he later tried to change it, filled in the blanks of the tragic sequence of events. Investigators also discovered that Hoffman had used the $200 stolen from Molly to go shopping with his girlfriend, a chilling detail that showed the perpetrator's callousness immediately after committing the crime. Investigators had enough evidence to convict Hoffman, but they had no idea that the real legal battle was just beginning, a battle that would last for nearly 3 decades, traverse every level of court, and challenge Louisiana's justice system, ultimately leading to a fierce debate about the very method of capital punishment. Robbed after his arrest, Jessie Hoffman Jr. was charged with first-degree murder. On January 8, 1997, a St. Tammany Parish grand jury officially indicted Hoffman. Under Louisiana law, this charge could lead to the death penalty. Hoffman's trial took place in 1998 before a 12-person jury, all of whom were white, a detail that Hoffman's lawyers would later use to appeal on grounds of racial bias. In the courtroom, the prosecution presented a compelling series of evidence: the ATM camera footage, the receipts, Hoffman's conflicting confessions, and the detail that he used the victim's money to go shopping. Their strategy was clear: use the physical evidence and Hoffman's own words to prove the brutality and premeditated nature of the crime. The defense, facing undeniable evidence, did not attempt to prove Hoffman's innocence. Instead, they focused on mitigating the penalty. They painted a picture of a tragic childhood where Hoffman endured chronic abuse and neglect from his own mother. They argued that these traumas caused PTSD and brain damage, which impaired his ability to control his actions. This is a common strategy in death penalty cases. Admit the criminal act, but plead for mercy based on the defendant's painful past. In the courtroom, the concept of first-degree murder in Louisiana became central. It requires not only the act of killing, but also an aggravating factor, such as committing the crime during the course of another felony like kidnapping, robbery, or rape. Hoffman's case had all of these elements, making him fully eligible for the death penalty. On June 25, 1998, after considering all the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. Jessie Hoffman Jr. was guilty of first-degree murder. Just 2 days later, on June 27, the same jury returned with a decision on the penalty. They recommended the highest sentence: death. On September 11, 1998, the trial judge officially sentenced Hoffman to death based on the jury's recommendation. 2 months later, he was transferred to death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, beginning a nearly 3-decade-long appeal process. Jessie Hoffman's confessions were a jumble of lies and feeble attempts at self-defense, revealing a mind trying to escape the burden of the truth. His first statement to the police was a blatant fictional scenario. He spoke of a mysterious armed third man who suddenly appeared after he and Molly had consensual sex. According to this version, the stranger took Molly away and returned alone, implying that he was the real killer. This story was a clear attempt to blame a non-existent figure. When this story quickly collapsed under the weight of conflicting evidence, Hoffman changed his testimony in a later interrogation. This time, he admitted he fired the gun, but claimed it was an accident. He stated that the gun went off accidentally during a struggle with Molly. The authenticity of these statements was not difficult to analyze. Both versions were completely unbelievable. The third man story had no evidence to corroborate it and directly contradicted the ATM footage, which showed only Hoffman and Molly. The accidental discharge version was also refuted by the autopsy results. Molly was shot in the head execution style, a deliberate and cold-blooded act that was entirely inconsistent with an accidental shooting during a struggle. The jury saw through these lies. The inconsistencies in Hoffman's own testimony became one of the strongest pieces of evidence against him, showing a guilty conscience and a calculated attempt to cover up the truth. He was not a victim of circumstance or an unfortunate accident, but a premeditated killer who tried to manipulate the facts to escape justice. Hoffman's legal battle lasted for nearly 27 years, going through every level of court. Immediately after his conviction, his lawyers began a relentless series of appeals. The Louisiana Supreme Court rejected the first appeal in 2000, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case shortly thereafter. Over the years, federal appeals continued to be denied in 2012, 2014, and 2015. In 2021, Hoffman again filed an appeal with the Louisiana Supreme Court, this time arguing that the all-white jury violated his rights and that the death penalty was too harsh for someone who was only 18 when the crime was committed. The court again rejected the appeal, stating there was no evidence of racial bias and no legal consensus on prohibiting the execution of people under 21. At the same time, Hoffman was involved in another legal battle against Louisiana's very method of execution. Starting in 2012, he and other death row inmates sued the state over its lethal injection protocol, arguing it constituted cruel and unusual punishment. This lawsuit contributed to the stagnation of executions in Louisiana. However, in 2022, the lawsuit was dismissed by a federal judge. A major turning point occurred in 2024. Louisiana's new governor, Jeff Landry, a strong supporter of the death penalty, signed a bill allowing the use of nitrogen gas and the electric chair as alternative methods of execution. This move came after Alabama pioneered the use of nitrogen gas to execute Kenneth Eugene Smith, paving the way for Louisiana to resume executions after a 15-year hiatus. In February 2025, Louisiana Attorney General Liz Murrell announced that the state would proceed with executions by nitrogen gas. Jessie Hoffman was one of the first names on the list. On February 12, 2025, a death warrant was signed, setting Hoffman's execution date for March 18, 2025. The final legal race began. Hoffman's lawyers immediately challenged the nitrogen gas execution protocol. A federal judge, Shelley Dick, initially agreed and ordered a stay of execution for further review of this untested method in Louisiana. She argued that Hoffman's claustrophobia and reliance on meditation to control his mental state could make wearing the gas mask a form of psychological torture, violating his religious and constitutional rights. On March 17, 2025, 24 hours before the execution was to be carried out, the atmosphere at the Louisiana State Penitentiary grew tense. Inside, Jessie Hoffman went through his final procedures. He was allowed to make final phone calls and meet with family members. His Buddhist advisor was also present, providing him with spiritual support in his final hours. According to prison officials, Hoffman's mood was noted as calm and accepting of his fate. He had spent many years on death row preparing for this moment. When asked about a special last meal, a traditional ritual for death row inmates, Jessie Hoffman declined. He did not request any specific food. This act, this silence, could be interpreted in many ways: resignation, a final act of defiance, or simply that he no longer had a mind for worldly needs. When he was taken to the execution chamber, Hoffman also refused to make a final statement. In the presence of witnesses, including media representatives and family, he did not say a word. His silence left a void, an unanswered question about his remorse or his final thoughts on the crime he committed. The meaning of this silence will forever remain a mystery, but it had a powerful effect on those present in the room, creating a heavy and solemn atmosphere. At 6:12 p.m., Hoffman was taken into the execution chamber. The execution process began. Pure nitrogen gas was pumped into his mask for about 19 minutes. A state official admitted that during the process, Hoffman had a few convulsive movements before becoming still. At 6:50 p.m. on March 18, 2025, Jessie Dean Hoffman Jr. was pronounced dead. With Hoffman's death, a dark chapter spanning nearly 3 decades officially closed. Louisiana carried out its first execution in 15 years, and its first ever use of nitrogen gas. Immediately after the execution, mixed reactions erupted. Governor Jeff Landry issued a strong statement asserting that Louisiana will not tolerate heinous acts of violence and the state will always prioritize victims over criminals. For him, this was a victory for law and order. In contrast, Cecilia Koppel, one of Hoffman's lawyers, condemned the execution as meaningless. She argued that the Hoffman of 2025 was no longer the cold-blooded killer of 1996, but had become a father, a husband, and a man who showed remarkable capacity for redemption. Andy Elliott, Molly's husband, released an emotional statement. He said the news of the execution was both bittersweet and a relief, that the long-standing nightmare was finally over, even though it brought back pain for his family. He also expressed empathy for Hoffman's family, who had also endured this ordeal for nearly 30 years through no fault of their own. He hoped Hoffman's death could lead to meaningful changes in the capital punishment system, ensuring that cases could be resolved within a reasonable time frame. Ilona, the wife who married Hoffman while he was in prison, wrote a tribute, describing him as a beautiful soul of love and redemption, and that the system failed by not helping him as a child and ultimately executing him. Hoffman's execution has opened the door to the possibility of more executions in Louisiana, with other death row inmates such as Larry Roy and Daryl James Robinson awaiting. Its long-term impact on the law and legal proceedings remains to be seen. The case is closed, but the questions about the nature of crime, redemption, and justice remain. Why could a good student commit such a horrific crime? Is childhood abuse a valid explanation or just an excuse? The biggest question that remains is, was nearly 30 years of waiting and a controversial execution truly justice or just a prolonged form of torture for everyone involved, from the victim's family to the perpetrator's family? This is a question that the justice system and society will continue to grapple with for years to come.